Once upon a time, there was a king and queen who had everything in the world that they could possibly wish for, except a child. At last, after 12 years, the queen gave birth to a son. But she did not live long enough to enjoy her happiness, for on the following day she died. But before her death, she called her husband to her and said, "Never let the child put his feet to the ground, for as soon as he does, he will fall into the power of a wicked fairy, who will do him much harm." And these were the last words the poor queen spoke. The boy grew big, and when he was too heavy for his nurse to carry, a chair was made for him on little wheels, in which he could wander through the palace gardens without help. And he was always carefully watched and guarded, for fear that he should at any time put his feet to the ground. But as this sort of life was bad for his health, the doctors ordered him horse exercise, and he soon became a first-rate rider, and would go out for long excursions on horseback, accompanied always by his father's stud groom. Every day he rode through the neighboring fields and woods, and always returned home in the evening safe and well. In this way many years passed, and the prince grew to manhood, and after a while he felt himself old enough and strong enough to disregard the queen's warning. One day the prince and some fellow horsemen went out for a ride in a wood where the king sometimes held a hunt. Their way led through a stream whose banks were overgrown with thick brushwood. Just as the horsemen were about to ford the river, a hare, startled by the sound of the horse's hooves, started up from the grass and ran towards the thicket. The young prince pursued the little creature, and had almost overtaken it when the girth of his saddle suddenly broke in two, and he fell heavily to the ground. No sooner had his foot touched the earth than he disappeared before the eyes of the horrified horsemen. They sought him far and near, but it was all in vain, and they were forced to recognize the power of the evil fairy, against which the queen had warned them on her deathbed. The old king was much grieved when they brought him the news of his son's disappearance, but as he could do nothing to free him from his fate, he gave himself up to an old age of grief and loneliness, cherishing at the same time the hope that some lucky chance might one day deliver the youth out of the hands of his enemy. As for the prince, hardly had he touched the ground when he felt himself violently seized by an unseen power and hurried away. In the blink of an eye, a whole new world stretched out before him, quite unlike the one he had left. A splendid castle surrounded by a huge lake was the abode of the wicked fairy, and the only approach to it was over a bridge of clouds. On the other side of the lake, high mountains rose up, and dark woods stretched along the banks. Over all hung a thick mist, and deep silence reigned everywhere. No sooner had the fairy reached her own domain than she made herself visible. She then turned to the prince and told him that unless he obeyed all of her commands down to the smallest detail, he would be severely punished. And with that, she presented him with an axe made of glass, and ordered him to cross the bridge of clouds into the wood beyond, and cut down all the trees there before sunset. As the prince took the axe, the wicked fairy cautioned him with many angry words against speaking to a little black-haired girl he would most likely meet in the wood. The prince listened to her words meekly and set out for the forest. At every step he seemed to sink into the clouds, but fear gave wings to his feet, and he crossed the lake safely and set to work at once. But no sooner had he struck the first blow with his axe than it broke into 1,000 tiny pieces against the tree. The prince was so terrified he did not know what to do, for he was in mortal dread of the punishment that the wicked old fairy was sure to inflict upon him. He wandered to and fro in the wood, not knowing where he was going, and at last, worn out by fatigue and misery, he collapsed onto the ground and fell asleep. He did not know how long he had slept when a sudden sound awoke him, and upon opening his eyes he saw a little black-haired girl standing beside him. Mindful of the fairy's warning, he did not dare to address her, but she on her part greeted him in the most friendly manner, and asked him at once if he was under the power of the wicked fairy. The prince nodded his head silently in answer. The little girl then told him that she too was in the power of the fairy, who had doomed her to wander about cold in the forest until a young man more cursed than she should allow her help and swallow his pride. Only then would she be able to cross the river which they saw in the distance, on the other side of which the fairy's domain and power ended. The girl's words so inspired the prince with confidence that he told her his tale of woe, and thought it in both their best interest for him to ask her advice as to how he might escape the wrath of the wicked fairy. "First you must know," answered the little girl, "that the fairy whose power we are both under is my own mother, but you must not betray this secret, for it would cost me my life. If you will only promise to trust me and not question a single piece of advice I give you, I will accomplish on your behalf all the tasks which my mother sets you." The prince nervously agreed. Then, having once more warned him not to betray her confidence, the little girl handed him a goblet to drink from, and the potion soon sunk his senses into a deep slumber. His astonishment was great when he awoke to find the glass axe whole and unbroken at his side, and all of the trees in the wood cut down around him. He made haste across the bridge of clouds and told the fairy that her commands were obeyed. She was much amazed when she heard that all the wood was cut down, and saw the axe unbroken in his hand. But since she could not believe that he had done all of this by himself, she questioned him narrowly if he had seen or spoken to the little black-haired girl. But the prince lied to the wicked fairy, and swore he had never looked up from his work for a moment. Seeing she could get nothing more out of him, she gave him a little bread and water, and then showed him to a small dark cupboard, where she ordered him to sleep for the night. Morning had hardly dawned when the fairy awoke the prince and gave him the glass axe again. She ordered him to go back to the wood and to chop all the fallen trees into small logs and bundle them for firewood. She then warned him once more against approaching or speaking to the little black-haired girl should he happen to meet her in the wood. Although his task was no easier than that of the day before, the prince set out much more cheerfully, because he knew he could count on the help of his new little friend. With quicker and lighter steps, he crossed the bridge of clouds, and hardly had he reached the other side when he saw the little black-haired girl standing before him, greeting him cheerfully. When she heard what the fairy demanded this time, she answered with a smile, "Never fear," and handed him another potion, which caused the prince again to sink into a deep sleep. When he awoke, everything was done. All the trees of the wood were cut up into firewood and arranged in bundles ready for use. He returned to the castle as quickly as he could and told the fairy that her commands were obeyed. She was even more amazed than she had been before, and asked him again if he had either seen or spoken to the little black-haired girl. But the prince knew better than to betray his word, and once more denied having met her. On the following day, the fairy set him a third task to do, even harder than the first two. She told him he must build a castle on the other side of the lake, made of nothing but gold, silver, and precious stones, and unless he could accomplish this within 1 hour, the most frightful doom awaited him. The prince heard her words without anxiety, so entirely did he rely on the help of his little friend. Full of hope, he hurried across the bridge and recognized at once the spot where the castle was to stand, for spades, hammers, axes, and every other building implement lay scattered on the ground, ready for the workman's hand. But of gold, silver, and precious stones there was not a sign. But before the prince had time to feel despondent, the little girl beckoned to him in the distance from behind a rock, where she had hidden herself for fear that her mother should catch sight of her. Full of joy, the prince hurried towards her and begged her aid and counsel in the new piece of work that he had been given to do. But this time the fairy had watched the prince's journey across the clouds from her highest window, and saw him hiding behind the rock with her daughter. She uttered a piercing shriek so that the mountains echoed with the sound of it. The terrified youths had hardly dared to look out from their hiding place when the enraged woman hurried over the bridge of clouds. The prince at once gave himself up for lost, but the little girl told him to be of good courage and to follow her as quickly as he could. Upon leaving their shelter, the little girl broke off a little piece of rock, spoke some magic words over it, and threw it in the direction her mother was coming from. In a moment, a glittering palace arose before the eyes of the fairy, and blinded her with its dazzling splendor, and with its many doors and passages prevented her for some time from finding her way out of it. In the meantime, the little black-haired girl hurried on with the prince, hastening to reach the river, where once on the other side they would forever be out of the wicked fairy's power. But before they had journeyed half the way, they heard again the rustle of the fairy's garments, and her muttered curses pursuing them closely. The prince was terrified. He dared not look back, and he felt his strength giving way. But before he had time to despair, the black-haired girl uttered some more magic words, and immediately she herself was changed into a pond, and the prince into a duck swimming on its surface. When the fairy saw this, her rage knew no bounds, and she used all her magic wits to make the pond disappear. She caused a hill of sand to arise at her feet, meaning it to dry up the water at once. But the sandhill only drove the pond further away, and its waters seemed to increase instead of diminishing. When the old woman saw that her powers were of so little avail, she angrily began throwing stones into the pond, hoping in this way to catch the duck. But all her efforts were fruitless, for he refused to let himself be caught. Then a new idea struck the wicked fairy, and she hid herself behind the rock which had previously sheltered the two fugitives. She quietly waited behind it, watching carefully for the moment when the prince and her daughter should resume their natural forms and continue their journey. She had not to wait long, for as soon as the girl thought her mother was gone, she changed herself and the prince once more into their human shape, and set out cheerfully for the river. But they had not gone many steps before the wicked fairy hurried after them, a drawn dagger in her hand, and was close upon them. Then suddenly, instead of the prince and her daughter, she found herself in front of a great stone church, the entrance of which was carefully guarded by a huge monk. Breathless with rage and passion, she tried to plunge her dagger into the monk's heart, but it fell shattered in pieces at her feet. In her desperation, she determined to pull down the church and thus to destroy her two victims forever. She stomped 3 times on the ground, and the earth trembled, and both the church and the monk began to shake. As soon as the fairy saw this, she retreated to some distance from the building, so as not to be hurt herself by its fall. But once more her scheme was doomed to failure, for hardly had she gone a yard from the church when both it and the monk disappeared, and she found herself in a wood black as night, and full of wolves and bears and wild animals of all sorts and descriptions. Then her wrath gave place to terror, for she feared every moment to be torn in pieces by the beasts, who one and all seemed to defy her power. She thought it wisest to make her way as best she could out of the forest, and to continue pursuing the fugitives once she could fashion a torch for light. In the meantime, the prince and the little black-haired girl again assumed their natural forms, and were hurrying as fast as they could to reach the river. But when they got there, they found that there was no way in which they could cross it, for the little girl's magic seemed no longer to have any power. She then turned to the prince and said, "The hour for my deliverance has not yet come, but as you promised, you must do exactly as I bid you now. Take this bow and these arrows and kill every beast you see with them, and be sure you spare no animal, however small, and I will see you once your trust in me has been proven." With these words she disappeared, and hardly had she done so than a huge wild boar started out of the thicket and made straight for the prince. But he did not lose his presence of mind, and drawing his bow, he pierced the beast with his arrow right through the skull. The creature fell heavily on the ground, and out of its side sprang a little hare, which ran like the wind along the river bank. The prince drew his bow once more, and the hare lay dead at his feet, but at the same moment a dove rose up in the air and circled around the prince's head in the most confiding manner. But mindful of the little girl's commands, he dared not spare the little creature's life, and taking another arrow from his quiver, he laid it as dead as the boar and the hare. But when he went to look at the body of the bird, he found, instead of the dove, a round white egg lying on the ground. As he gazed upon it and wondered what it could mean, he heard the sweepings of wings above him, and looking up, he saw a huge vulture with open claws swooping down upon him. In a moment he seized the egg and flung it at the bird with all his might, and lo and behold, instead of the ugly beast, the most beautiful princess he had ever seen stood before the astonished eyes of the prince. As the egg tumbled back down to earth, it cracked, and the little black-haired girl crawled out of it and introduced the newly freed princess as her elder sister. But while all of this was going on, the wicked old fairy had managed to make her way out of the wood. The three youths hurried across the river, which the little black-haired girl had temporarily frozen. The fairy chased them with her torch as far as she could, but halfway across the frozen river, the flame melted the surface, and the river consumed the evil fairy queen. And so at last the little girl, the prince, and his soon-to-be princess bride were free. They hurried as quickly as they could to the old king, who received them with joy and gladness. On the following day, a most gorgeous wedding feast was held, with music and dancing, and naturally, with the little black-haired girl, who was the prince's most trusted friend, and now his sister-in-law, as the flower girl.